5 years ago, Chicago found itself at the center of a national debate on public education.
The Chicago School Board has just voted to close 49 schools. It is the largest mass public school closing in U.S. history.
The largest mass public school closing in U.S. history. The affected students, teachers, and parents were devastated, and their outcry was staggering.
You should not be closing these schools without walking into them, seeing what is happening in these schools.
But the Chicago Public Schools Administration stood firm. It argued that these schools were underutilized and underperforming, that closing them would ultimately be better for students. The members of those school communities, however, saw it differently.
Sometimes I think that we are all pieces in a game that they're playing.
And for University of Chicago scholar Eve Ewing, who was in a master's program at Harvard at the time, the public reaction raised an unusual question. If these schools are so bad, why are people fighting so hard to save them?
Yeah, I think that we make educational policy decisions using a certain sets of criteria and decision-making factors, and I think people relate to the idea that sometimes those factors don't show the complete picture. And I was frustrated at my own lack of understanding, and so that's kind of what sparked the book project.
That project would end up becoming her critically acclaimed book, Ghosts In The Schoolyard, which was published last year. It is a deep and nuanced investigation of public school closings, explaining how history, race, and something called institutional mourning all intersect with educational policy. The conclusions and lessons from her work reverberate well beyond Chicago.
I think that people recognize that this is a story about how we make decisions that impact people who are already vulnerable and marginalized in the cities in which we live.
From the University of Chicago, this is Big Brains, stories behind the pioneering research and pivotal breakthroughs that are reshaping our world. On this first episode of Season 2, Eve Ewing and the Ghosts in Our Schoolyards. I'm your host, Paul Rand. For Eve Ewing, studying public education policy, specifically public education in Chicago, is an incredibly personal project.
So I grew up here in Chicago, and I was a Chicago public school student.
She spent her childhood in the Logan Square neighborhood on the north side of the city, an area that's gentrified since she's lived there.
So I'm a time traveler from a neighborhood that doesn't exist anymore.
Okay.
So I'm from the past.
And Ewing's experience as a student in Chicago schools would forever change her understanding of the systems underlying public education and would eventually shape her research.
So I went to a magnet school. I took the school bus every day.
Okay.
And when Logan Square, where I grew up, was then an almost entirely Mexican and Puerto Rican neighborhood. And so I got on a bus, and there would be me and my brother as some of the only black kids in our neighborhood. And then we would go to our school, and our school had, people from all different racial backgrounds. And so right away, there's this awareness of, when I get to school, I have friends that are white and black and Asian and Mexican American and Polish and Jewish and all these different backgrounds, but everybody on the bus looks like me. Everybody on the bus is brown.
Okay.
Noticing those things as a kid was really important for me. People think children don't see race. They do. And what they do is they do their best to make meaning of it with or without adults around to guide them, right? And so those experiences made me start thinking about schools pretty young. And then the thing that was the final straw was my brother went to a different high school than I did. So I went to Northside College Prep, which is a building that cost $44 million to build. We had brand new graphing calculators. We had computers in every room. There are 7 different languages taught at Northside. Cafeteria, gym, Olympic swimming pool, brand new theater. And my brother's high school, at times there were kids fighting in the hallway. There was a lot of gang activity. He felt really unsafe there. Once there was a teacher who put chains on the bathroom doors. Seeing those differences, we live in a society where people really believe deeply in meritocracy. And there's a narrative when you go to a school like Northside, people tell you that you earned it or that you deserve it. And it was very hard for me to reconcile the idea that I got to have certain opportunities or certain facilities that other kids didn't, and that the supposed reason was that I'm somehow more deserving. And I didn't feel that just because my brother got like a C in math means that he shouldn't be able to learn a second language or swim in a nice pool.
Ewing carried those questions with her when she came to the University of Chicago as an undergraduate. At first, she wanted to be a journalist or writer, but then she got involved with the neighborhood schools program and fell in love with teaching.
Number one, I love children. I think kids are really magical and incredible. And the small moments of revelation that they experience on a daily basis are pretty, nothing short of miraculous to me. But I also saw how a lot of things that I really care about, like public health and housing and poverty and equity, were really coming to bear in the classroom. So I became a teacher after I graduated college. I loved being a teacher. I taught 6th, 7th, and 8th grade.
Okay.
There was one day when my principal called us all in for 8 a.m. staff meeting, and she said, cancel your vacations, pay off your credit cards, because, there's huge budget cuts coming down the line. And we were told that I, as a teacher, my job would probably be safe, but that we were looking at layoffs of our custodians, our engineers, our clerks, our assistant principals, our security guards. And I went out to my classroom that day and I thought about how I was maybe going to have a job, but if the heat broke, there was going to be nobody to fix the heat. If somebody called, if a parent called to talk to me on the phone, there'd be no clerk to answer the phone. If somebody threw up, there'd be nobody to clean it. And it just frustrated me to think about trying to do my work in that kind of setting. And when I got to my classroom, I was teaching an 8th grade homeroom. And I got there and I looked at my students, and we as a group were having a great year. And I felt like I had worked really hard to make an amazing classroom community, and my students had worked really hard to make that community. And my principal was great, and my colleagues were great. And so I kind of looked around like, well, whose fault is this? And I realized that in that moment, it felt like the building was literally crumbling around me. And it was very frustrating to think that we were facing these decisions and nobody in the building was accountable for them. Nobody who was behind the decisions would ever come and talk to us about it. And so that's when I decided I wanted to go to graduate school, because I wanted to understand why it is that way and to try to meet the people. I wanted to understand who the people are that make these decisions.
To find the answers to those questions, Ewing went to the Harvard Graduate School of Education. But it wasn't long before a public education crisis would draw her back home. When the school closings were announced in Chicago, she pulled out her laptop and frantically scrolled through the names of closing schools. Then she saw it. The school where she had previously taught was on the list.
It was really an emotionally devastating moment, because Barbara Bird Bennett, who was the CEO of for non-Chicagoans, that's what we call our superintendent here. We call them the CEO, which no commentary on that for now, but
look it up, folks.
Yeah,
see why she says that.
Exactly. She was quoted in the newspaper as saying, we have to close these schools because they're struggling schools, they're failing, they're under-resourced, they're underutilized. And when I heard that, I just visualized my school building and the beautiful paint on the walls and the students and their smiles and all the things that we as educators worked so hard to give them, and the amazing learning environment that was so nurturing that we had worked to construct. And I knew that that wasn't what people would picture when they read these words. And I knew that people who had never been to the school or who had never been to a school like this would kind of draw on their own stereotypes, as well as the images that we portray in the media of what public schools look like, especially public schools primarily serving low-income Black students. And that all those stereotypes would kind of fill their heads, and that they would take it at face value that, okay, sure, sounds good, close it, seems bad. That was really upsetting.
So she decided to do something to upend the narrative. She began investigating the closing schools and the people who lived in those communities, not as numbers on spreadsheets or test scores in a binder, but as individuals with stories and a history. That investigation would become her critically acclaimed book, Ghosts in the Schoolyard. What she discovered after the break.
Capitalism is the engine of prosperity.
Actually, it sows the seeds of its own demise.
Could both be right? I'm Kate Waldock from Georgetown University.
And I'm Luigi Zingales from the University of Chicago.
We're the hosts of Capital Isn't, a podcast about what's working in capitalism today.
And most importantly, what isn't.
We're going to share the sort of irreverent banter you'd hear between economists at a bar.
That is, if economists were to go to a bar.
Subscribe to Capital Isn't. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts.
The central question of Ghosts in the Schoolyard is surprising and led Ewing to some revelatory discoveries. If these schools were so bad, why did people fight so hard to save them? One of the major flashpoints where this question came into play was the battle to save one specific school scheduled to close, Walter H. Diet High.
People in the community were really upset because with the closure of Diet, it would mean that that was going to be the last open enrollment neighborhood school in the area. So a neighborhood school meaning they have to take anybody who lives in the residential area. So a group of parents, community members, and teachers and allies fought this vehemently, and ultimately they went on a hunger strike for 34 days to try to keep the school open.
Now, this is a school that supposedly is not very good, but people are going on a 34-day hunger strike.
Right. Yeah, that's really kind of the crux of the matter is that exactly that. If a school is so bad, why would people go on a hunger strike? Literally facing death. I mean, some of them were hospitalized. There was press conferences from nurses and one of the former surgeon generals of the city, public health leaders saying this is really, truly a danger to folks. It really called a lot of attention to asking that question of, okay, well, somebody sees value in this institution. And so why is that?
I'm out here on a hunger strike because I live in a city that doesn't respect me or my children because of the color of our skin or because of our income.
And I think that the symbolism of the name as well, Diet, is important because Walter H. Diet, who the school is named after, he was a music teacher here in Chicago in the 1940s after the Great Migration. And he was a music teacher for people like Nat King Cole, Dinah Washington, many famous jazz musicians, but also many regular kids whose names we'll never know. And it's very rare to have a school that's named after a teacher, right? When was the last time you heard of a school that was named after a teacher and not a famous historical figure?
Right.
And so it was really important to the hunger strikers to actually say the name of the school matters, and we want it to be Diet High School, Walter H. Diet High School. And an interesting thing about the school closures was that the matter of names ended up being really important symbolically because many of the schools that were destined to close were actually named after famous Black people, often famous Black Chicagoans. So Mahalia Jackson Elementary, Mahalia Jackson being a famous gospel singer here. Daniel Hale Williams is one of the schools I write about in the book, and he was the first physician to perform the first documented successful heart surgery in the United States. And he also ran Provident Hospital on King Drive, which was one of the first hospitals that actually served Black people in the city when there weren't other hospitals that would do that. These are important people. And so it was also symbolic to talk about those closures in that regard.
And when you start taking schools away from our communities that are named after Black heroes, you take away our history. And the quickest way to destabilize and to kill the hope and the future of a community is to take away its history.
So the decisions were being communicated that it was because of the performance of the schools. But you said not necessarily so. This is something, I think you were talking about it in terms of being, if I have this word right, structural racism. Is that right?
Yes. Well, structural racism is a way of understanding racism that is not about individual people and their biases or their prejudices, but actually the ways in which decisions that are made across structures, like, for example, a school system, differentially affect different groups of people based on race. So even though the justification that was given was this building underutilization, 88% of the students that were displaced by school closures were Black. Across the city, 1 in 4 of the schools that had majority Black teachers and majority Black students were closed. Now, the pushback to that Barbara Byrd Bennett, the CEO, and others said was, well, it just happens to be that this is where the students are, right? It just so happens to be that these students are majority Black and they just happen to be in these empty buildings. And one thing I talk about in the book is that there's nothing incidental about this, that the very high concentration of Black students in those neighborhoods and in those buildings was actually a result of segregationist policies, both in housing and in schools throughout the 20th century. So the students were clustered in those places for a reason. And the thing about structural racism is it doesn't have to tie back to somebody's malicious intent. It's about the disproportionate impact on groups of people. And so regardless of what Barbara Byrd Bennett may have intended or what school leaders may have intended, if Black students are the ones who bear the brunt of this dispossession and displacement, then we say this is a structurally racist outcome because it is within the structure that they are going to be disproportionately harmed.
Toward the end of Ghosts in the Schoolyard, Ewing writes that another central factor that's important to understand in all of this is how neoliberalism has shaped our education policy decisions and has been a driving force in the school choice debate.
So neoliberalism is basically the idea that our society will do best if we behave as consumers in a marketplace. And if we use the resources available to us to go out and earn as best as we can and access the things that will make our lives easier and better. And it's different from thinking about ourselves as people who have rights to access certain kinds of things. Now, the way that this is played out in education is that we now in the past couple of decades have started thinking about schools and talking about schools not as things that we have rights to. Everybody has the idea of everybody having a right to a good school, but rather something that we are to consume and choose. The same way we might, I think I say in the book, choose a cereal in a cereal aisle, that we look at the nutrition facts, we think about our personal preferences, we think about how much money we have, and we make the consumer choice that's best for us. So neoliberalism in education has kind of applied that same kind of thinking to schools, where schools should be competing with each other. Whichever one is the best will win out. Whichever one is the worst will fail in the marketplace. And that's kind of the natural order of things. And the problem with that is that there are children involved. And so, number one, we live in an unequal society where people have disparate abilities to go out and behave as these quote-unquote conscious consumers. So, for instance, many people in Chicago do not have access to a car or reliable transportation, reliable childcare. Those are all things that can impact where you would actually be able to send your kid to school. It's not just a matter of, I'm going to look at the data and pick the best school. And the second thing is that the cost of failure is very high. When a school is dying or struggling because it's been starved of resources, there are still children in that building who are then being deprived of a high-quality education, and they don't deserve to be given less resources just because their school has been deemed a failure by the broader public. And often those students are the very same students that are facing the most tremendous obstacles in other areas of their life. They are the homeless students. They are the students whose parents are struggling with drug abuse or addiction. It becomes sort of a vicious cycle wherein we punish those who already don't have a whole lot. And neoliberalism basically excuses that by saying, well, you couldn't compete.
Ewing calls the grief and loss people experience after a school closing institutional mourning. And for some people, it can feel as painful as losing a loved one. She writes, quote, "In losing a school, one loses a version of oneself."
Yeah, well, many of us have, can I ask you, where did you go to school as a kid?
I went to the school in Youngstown, Ohio.
Oh,
Steel
great.
Mill Town in Youngstown, Ohio.
Being a Midwesterner and being from Youngstown, I'm sure people probably had a close sense of affinity with the mill, right?
Absolutely.
With the school. And for most of us, when we have these memories, we walk by our school. If you were to go back right now, all these years later, and walk by your elementary school, you'd probably see yourself, right? There you go on that one day when you were late for school because something happened, or when somebody dared you to kiss somebody, or, when somebody challenged you to a race and you won after you tried all those times and lost, or when you were embarrassed because you didn't know the answer in math class. All those things are things that are so remote from our adult lives, right? You're all these years and all those miles away, but those are still part of you. There's something about the place and about the building and the site of these memories that is really special to people. And it's hard to put a monetary value on that. Many of the kids in these schools that closed had almost familial relationships with the teachers, with their classmates. Sure. They also had multi-generational familial attachments to the school. So some of the students go to the same school where their parents, their grandparents went. They feel like this is part of themselves. This is an institution where their own lives find meaning and resonance and safety. So when I say a school is a part of you, it's a version of yourself, it's all of those selves that experienced loss and love and human connection for the first time.
So this was the concept of institutional mourning?
Yes, precisely. In the book, I have an idea called institutional mourning, which is a theory I put forth about the ways that in some cases we mourn institutions the same way we would mourn a human loss. The theory sort of developed out of my interviews with folks in the community because people talked about their lost school as though they were talking about a lost person often. And they described very intense feelings of emotional longing and grief in the way they talked about their schools. That was very striking to me, and it also was commensurate with my own sort of emotional experience that catalyzed my desire to write the book. And I think institutional mourning, obviously in the book I'm writing about it in the context of schools, but I think that people also experience this when it comes to public housing, with other beloved community institutions that get torn down or closed up, where you feel a pang of hurt and grief and loss every time you're near that site.
Ewing's work in public education is important. It changes the way we should understand how schools serve students and families beyond test scores, and it causes us to pause and consider how history can affect policy. But Ewing's work extends far beyond the world of academic writing. She's also a poet and a comic book writer. Despite how disparate these projects might seem from being a scholar, she says it's all really part of the same project. That's coming up after the break. If you're listening to Big Brains, there's a good chance you consider yourself a lifelong learner. However, you may not know about the University of Chicago's Graham School and its focus on continuing liberal and professional studies. For more than a century, Graham has been a destination for lifelong learners. They offer courses online and in the classroom, bringing the transformative education UChicago is known for to students of all ages. To learn more about the courses, certificates, and degrees, visit graham.uchicago.edu. When Ewing isn't working on public policy, she's continuing her prolific career as a poet. Her books of poetry have won numerous awards. And she also writes comic books for Marvel, currently Ironheart, featuring Riri Williams, a female super genius from the south side of Chicago.
So Marvel approached me, and, in my first conversations with them, I wanted to basically talk about what I think comics are for and what I think superheroes are for. And I think that they serve a really important place in our kind of national mythology because they're the place where we work out what does it mean to be good? What does it mean to save people? What does it mean to be a hero? What do you do when you have a lot of power but you are also deeply flawed? And so Ironheart, the fact that she is a superhero who's from Chicago, who's from the South Side, in many ways challenges what people assume when they think about a typical superhero. She's a Black teenage girl. And nevertheless, she is grappling with those same kinds of questions. That's part of the kind of imagining of a better space that I want to be able to do is to be able to ponder those questions in public in this very fun way. And it happens to be fun, but it's also part of the work of political transformation to be able to imagine what comes after. And I think that in order to really transform the world in which we live, we can't simply come up with things that are a rebuttal to the reality as we know it. We also have to have the fortitude and the bravery to think about what comes after. That, to me, is the work of imagination. It's fun, and it's also radical. People often say, you have so many projects, and I think of myself as having really one project that has a lot of component parts.
Okay.
And I think for me, I'm interested, I love writing and I love teaching, and I'm interested in using primarily the written word to create spaces to reimagine what kind of home is worthy of the amazing people that live in this city. And a lot of the things that I write about in Ghosts in the Schoolyard and kind of nonfiction writing, things like racism, violent policing, segregation, poverty, transit inequity, health inequity, et cetera, all these really tough, terrible things. I think that my job as a writer is to certainly try to document those things, but also try to create spaces for us to imagine something else and to uplift, celebrate, acknowledge, and see the people who nevertheless make a home here despite the challenges of all those things. So that's kind of my project. That's my one project.
Sense. So you're a poet.
I am.
Do you have a favorite poem or a line that you just really love?
Oh, yeah. One of my favorite poets is Gwendolyn Brooks, and she's the poet who's had the greatest impact on me, not just as a writer, but in the way I try to move in the world as a writer and the way I try to live my life. And she has a poem where she says, say to them, say to the downkeepers, the sun slappers, the self-soilers, the harmony hushers, even if you are not ready for day, it cannot always be night. And I think that kind of sums up, and that's
wow, that is something, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's from a poem called Speech to the Young, Speech to the Progress Toward. So it's her writing to her 2 children and to other young people. And I think a lot of the things that I write about feel really insurmountable. The classes I teach here, I teach a class called The Social Meaning of Race, and I teach a class called Race in American Public Schools. And my students every week, they feel like, well, what are we supposed to do? Because they come in and they understand more than they ever have about the enormity of inequality in our country, and they feel hopeless. But the thing is that these are structures that took multiple centuries to construct, and it's really unfair of us to expect of ourselves that we're going to deconstruct them in a year or a decade or even a lifetime. But at the same time, we're beholden to the people who come after us to try our best. And so I don't expect that the kind of metaphorical day that Gwendolyn Brooks is talking about in her poem, I don't expect to see that in my lifetime, but I know that the night can't last forever.
Big Brains is a production of the UChicago podcast network. If you like what you heard, please give us a review and a rating. Thanks to Eve Ewing for joining our program. Be sure to be on the lookout for her second book of poetry coming out in June. It's called 1919, and it's about the 1919 race riot in Chicago. Thanks to WBEZ and Linda Lutton for providing some of the audio clips you heard in this episode. Our show is hosted by Paul M. Rand and produced by me, Matt Hodap. Thanks for listening.